Power framework. And actually, I saw Cedar's face on the screen, and Cedar is the author of the Right Use of Power framework. And so there's lots of pressure for me to make sure that I get it right, but also lots of wisdom in the house. So we're going to talk a little bit about power just to set the context for how does collective power fit into this conversation. Then I'm going to turn it over to Janice and Farzin, and they're going to talk about some of the opportunities and some of the realities that we face when we're trying to develop and leverage and use collective power, particularly in the workplace, but probably that conversation can expand and contract quite a bit. So we'll see where that goes. And then we're going to pass it over to Ted to introduce us to some of the sociocracy principles around self-organization and self-management and distributing power, and how some practical ways that we can actually start to do that. And then we're going to do a bit of a lightning round around our top tips or favorite resources, things that are resonating with us, and then open it up for question and response. And so that's the plan, and we'll see if we stick to it or if we get sidetracked or derailed. And again, this is your panel today. I'm not sure that my face belongs on there as a thought leader, but here we are. We have thoughts and we lead various things. And so I guess we're thought leaders. A couple of housekeeping items. You probably heard the recording signal go off. We are going to record this so that we can share it after the fact. And if there's some great nuggets, we'll cut those up and share them via social media and various places. We'd love this to be engaging. If you've been to one of the Ally Co lunch and learns before, you know that we love the conversation. We love when the chat gets filled up with comments and questions. We won't be doing breakouts today, just with the size of the group and the content that we have to cover, but engage in a way that's meaningful for you. And use the chat, like I said, ask questions, respond to things that people are saying, drop resources. If you've come across things that are really helpful on this journey, we'd love all of that. So please make it engaging, not just a sit back and listen type of thing. Lean in a little bit and contribute to the best you can. So let's talk a little bit about power first. And what is power? Because it's one of those concepts that each of us has our own lived experience with. All of us have a perspective on what power is and whether it's negative, whether it's positive. I was talking yesterday with the panel about how very few people that I meet, when you kind of dig into their perspective of power, truly have a neutral perspective around power. Usually we have a little bit of baggage from our experiences in life around seeing it as a positive thing or a negative thing in society. And that has us leaning away from it or leaning into it, as opposed to just being able to be with it. And I'd love for everybody to consider that power is neutral, that it can affect positive change and it can affect negative change. Also that it's pervasive. I'm not in a relationship with anyone in the world that doesn't have a power dynamic within it of some kind. And those two facts, neutral and pervasive, help us understand it as predictable. And so there's predictable things that start to happen inside of power dynamics. And if they're predictable, then we can start to think about how can we design our systems? How can we design these dynamics to alleviate some of the misuses maybe of power that we see in our world? So that's a pretty high level touch on a definition of power to consider. And then we're going to talk about the 5 types of power. I'm going to try and do this fairly quickly. Each one of these we could talk about for a day easily. So I'm going to do my best to keep it tight. All of us today exercised personal power, right? You got yourself here. You got yourself out of bed, got some coffee made, maybe got some breakfast, maybe took the dog for a walk, and you got yourself here. You exercised some personal agency and decision-making and choice, and you clicked the Zoom button, and here we are, right? So personal power is portable. It goes with us everywhere. I've got 3 small kids. I know Ted has 5 kids. Some of you might have lots of kids. My 10-year-old has lots of more personal power than my 5-year-old does. And so personal power is something that grows with us over time as we experience life, and we take that knowledge and those experiences, we turn them into skills and competencies, and they're portable, and we can take them with us where we go. And so that's, in a nutshell, personal power. The next type of power you're probably familiar with, and we have that here in the room today. Right now, I'm exercising role power as the host and moderator on this panel. So it's a position that I hold, and you're in a position of participant, or maybe you're in a position of panelist, right? There's a power dynamic there, right? I've got the mute button, and I can use it, right, if I need to, or I can unmute people. That it comes with it, power and responsibility. The third type of power is status power. And this type of power is the best way that I've been able to understand it is as membership, the membership that you hold in various types of identities, right? So as a cisgender, white, heterosexual male who speaks English, that's a collection of memberships that comes with it power, because society at large, the structure that we're a part of, has given power, or power has been allocated to those memberships and to those groups. And so we can start to see here that you're not just experiencing Jeff in his personal power, you're experiencing Jeff in his personal power, but also his role power as moderator and in my status power, your relationship with the identities that I hold, right? And so we start to see the intersection between these types of power. The fourth type of power is collective. And that's really what we're hoping to focus on today, is this idea of what happens when we collect power, when we collect ourselves into organizations or institutions or movements. It can be formal and informal. There's some collective power here today. There's a couple of AllyCo team members on the call. And so collectively, we have an identity. We have some power as a group, as does the panel, right? And the fifth type, and we're probably going to touch on this is Farzin's favorite place to have conversations, is this idea of structural power, right? What are the systems? What are the stories? What are the symbols? How do we understand power more broadly? The mindsets, the paradigms that we use in the world. What does that actually mean? And what does that look like? And so again, we could talk about the types of power for days on end, and I'd love to. And so feel free to reach out and we can have that conversation. Today, we want to focus on collective. And with that, I'm going to stop my share. And I think I'm just going to pass it right over to Farzin and Janice to get us started, kick us off. Let's talk about collective power in the world, in the workplace.
Thank you for that lovely sort of intro and background. Jeff, I love that. So I just wanted to, hi everyone. It's so nice to see all of your faces. I'm really excited for this conversation, but I just wanted to give a little bit of background context. Part of the reason why we felt like it was important to have this conversation is because of an article that I wrote. And I know that the panelists have spoken about this in different contexts, but I just wanted to share a little bit around what went into the thought behind that article. So I wrote an article a few months ago, and the title of the article was, is it possible to change an oppressive workforce from the inside? And I've been thinking a lot about this as an external consultant, the power that I have to change a environment or a company, and also the power that people who work internally have. And it seems like just in speaking with the friends that I have that do this work internally, that work as like chief diversity officers or diversity managers, it seems like there is often an impasse that they reach where it's really, really difficult to change the structure, especially if you're part of that structure or environment. So I really wanted us to explore that in a little bit more detail, because some of you may be in positions right now where you're trying to change the power structures or redistribute power within your organization, and you're trying to figure out how to do that. And I guess I wrote the article and I was sort of pessimistic. I'm also biased because I'm an external consultant, and I do feel like while it's not impossible to change the structures in which you work, I think it's really, 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 really challenging when you're trying to change the same people that are signing your paychecks. So I do think that that is an important thing that we have to sort of think about and talk about. And that's kind of part of the catalyst behind this conversation. But Farzin, you're one of my favorite, if not my favorite voice on LinkedIn, because you always sort of speak on some of these structural and systemic issues in a very sort of real and honest way. So I would love to hear your thoughts on like whether you actually think it's possible to change the structure that a person is part of, especially if you're a junior employee that maybe doesn't have a lot of power. How do you go about, or do you even think it's possible to go about to changing that structure?
I think your article, is it possible to change an oppressive workplace from the inside, like resonated with so many of us, because we've realized how much energy it takes to, on a personal level and even on a collective level, to kind of change these not just like, I'm not talking about even on a systemic level, just to make minor incremental changes in the workplace. I want to kind of take a step back and kind of go over a little bit of my kind of understanding of how we got here and why that's so difficult, before I kind of even go into, is it even possible? So the way I typically frame these things is that if we look at capitalism in its current form as an outgrowth of the systems of colonial oppression that have existed in its prior, that capitalism just kind of changed some of the players, as opposed to it being a state run enterprise where we're going to different territories across the planet and exploiting land, labor, and resources. The capitalists emerged out of the Industrial Revolution, which were kind of separate from the state kind of apparatuses. So like, because of that, there wasn't as much sort of structural like violence that was implemented as you'd see with colonialism, which is a literal movement to a place and taking of. It morphed a little bit. The violence just subsided just slightly, although you can make lots of arguments about capitalism is basically neocolonialism, all these things. But what happened was in our current structures that live in this capitalist society basically adopted the same structures of colonialism. You have very hierarchical systems where there are power brokers at the top. And if those power brokers emerged from Europe, they're obviously going to implant European values into the system. So you are constantly, if you're trying to make any sort of change, you're constantly swimming against this current, right? It takes a lot of sustained energy to make change, right? Unless you deconstruct the system and replace it with something that's much more egalitarian. I'll give you an example of how much energy it takes. Like, I believe it was in I think 2018 when workers at Google, and not unionized, these were just like an organized protest, about 20,000 across the globe, Google employees walked out, and that was because of sexual harassment in the workplace. The thing that they got was an apology and a commitment to stop forced arbitration, right? Something that should be normal. That was that incremental change. It took 20,000 employees to do that. And even then, you're still at the mercy of the power brokers of that system. So those employees, the 7 or so employees that organized the whole thing, were complained later about retaliation, right? So this wasn't necessarily, so it takes that kind of energy. But if we're trying to operate in this system, we have to think of ways of actually making that change. So we can do a mass protest, we can do a letter writing campaign where everybody signs. The best way in this current system, I believe, to check those power brokers and force their hand is through unionization, unions. But we all know that union power in this country is very low. So we think of other mechanisms. ERGs, employee resource groups, affinity groups, are more structured ways of making incremental change. Although they're still at the mercy of the system, they can be disbanded. So it is possible on an incremental level, but we still are at the mercy of the system. And usually the system or the house, the organization, tends to win out.
Yeah, I think what I think about a lot is accountability and how to hold leaders accountable, because I think accountability is a huge piece of the equation when we think about redistributing collective power. If leaders are being held accountable for the way that they treat people in the environments that they are creating, then they're going to be more mindful of those environments, and they're not going to treat people, they're not going to mistreat people. And Farzin, you brought up the Google walkout or the protests. I also remember, I think around that time, there was something very similar that happened with McDonald's, where they had different employees from different locations who were protesting the sexual misconduct that the employees had experienced with little to no repercussions for the people who had caused the harm. And I don't even really know what ended up happening in that case, probably something similar. So I think it's a really difficult question when we think about how do we hold leaders accountable, because leaders aren't incentivized to hold themselves accountable. There are often measures to assess equity and inclusion in an environmental level, but there aren't any sort of like sanctions if companies aren't following those rules or those objectives that they set out to follow. And I think one of the problems that I run into as an external consultant is Even within the employee resource groups and affinity groups, sometimes employees tell me that they feel like the group is just in place as sort of like as a nice to have, like they're not actually able to create change. So if the resource groups are mostly in many organizations, junior level employees, what power do they have, if any at all, to actually create change? And I think one of the things you talked about, Farzin, that's important is collective power. And though we might not have a lot of like status power or whatever it is in our companies, it's really important that we're coming together. And I think that there's a lot of power. If 20 of your employees are saying that they want something or that they need something, or they're posting about it on social media, I think that is one of the tools that we have to actually create change, is that companies are afraid of litigation and they're afraid of being blasted on social media. But even with that, I think companies rely on the world's forgetfulness. I think after a week or two, we get mad at a company, we might drag them on social media, and then people forget, and then they can kind of fall back into their old ways. And I think Starbucks is a great example. If you all remember in 2018, with the situation that happened where a manager in a Philadelphia Starbucks called the police on 2 Black men because they weren't buying any items. People protested Starbucks, people boycotted Starbucks. The then CEO apologized and he issued a public apology. And they did that 1-day anti-bias training or unconscious bias training. And 3 or 4 years later, I don't really know what else systemically has changed in those situations. So that's where I kind of struggle with, like, whether, and I say this to my friends who work internally, I think one of the things that is important to think about is when you're doing this work and you're working internally, how exhausting it can be. You're like fighting against a system or swimming against a system that, like you said, Farzin, that is not changing, or that seems like it's not changing. And it almost feels like, why am I here? Or why am I doing this work if I am constantly trying to like serve as a sort of like a protective barrier against the harm that employees are experiencing. And many times the folks that are doing this work belong to marginalized or have marginalized identities themselves. So you're navigating that and also navigating trying to change the system. And I just don't think one person ever has the power to do that. And maybe, again, I'm being kind of cynical or I'm being pessimistic, but I do think before going into this work, there has to be an understanding of how challenging it can be and how almost impossible it is when you're working by yourself to try to change the system. So I think part of the way that we get that accountability is by coming together as a collective.
Thanks, Janice. I want to highlight a couple of things that you said. Like, I fully agree with you on the limits of external accountability. I mean, I think putting things out there in social media, I mean, we've come to have such a fast-paced, like, we call it outrage culture, but it's really just kind of in the moment, right? Like, it does make some change, at least visibly in the moment. But again, like I mean, that's fleeting. It always reverts back to the system that we've designed for it. So if we place the power in the hands of a few individuals who have ultimate decision-making capacity, we're also putting power into the hands of things they don't like, their biases, you know, all these things that can influence. And eventually those things are going to come out. Like, you know, was it, I can't remember the philosopher that basically said, I'm the state, right? Like, referring to his authoritarian rule, like he is the arbiter of everything that happens in the state. And our organizations run very similarly, although nuanced, you know, it's a little bit distributed. But so I think like the skepticism of making change is very well received, and it's something I struggle with when I'm doing my trainings. Is like, how do we hold our organizations accountable? One thing that we definitely have to take into consideration is, going back to the Google example, is that it takes a lot of risk and responsibility to kind of, if you're a leader working up against the system, right? If you're leading the charge of resistance, there's a target on your back, right? You are the individual that's going to take the most brunt of it. So distributing that risk and responsibility, and making sure that as we exercise collective power, we see it through to the end. It's not just we've made our we've had our demands met on the outset. Accountability is making it sustainable, and also making sure that nobody who's involved is retaliated against, and that kind of thing. So there's a lot working against us, and even the greatest tool that we Tissa, thank you. It was Louis. It was the 14th, yeah, the Sun King, right? Or was it Napoleon? I'm sorry. It was French guy said it. Je suis l'état, I think it was. But anyhow, so I think it's very, very important to kind of recognize the risk in exercising collective power of the power of our networks. And so yeah, we have a lot to kind of think through.
Yeah, one question that I think is, and maybe I know we'll unpack it later as well, but one question that I think is important for us to talk about is how can employees organize collectively? Because I think the power is within the collective. And I think that it's important to also note that when we think about white supremacy as a system, one of the things that it does is it makes us feel separate and individual, and it takes us away from the community-oriented mindset. And I think that one of the fears with unionization within companies, leaders don't want us to come together, and leaders don't want people to unionize and to join, because there is an understanding that within the collective, there is a lot of power. So what do you think as far as ways that employees can organize collectively to bring about change that is sustainable?
I think honestly, like if you're able to, like collective bargaining, collective organization, either structured through union or walkouts, those do have the most effect, I believe. And unionization is a like a structural kind of an organizational, basically systematized check on that power. It's not in the moment. It's not ad hoc. It's there's a legacy of it. It's sustainable. So, but again, like it's so difficult because so many states in this country have created these right to work laws where it makes it almost nearly impossible to form and sustain a union, collect union fees and all these things. So if we can try and figure out ways of replicating union action, on labor rights, that is the best thing we can do in the moment. I did mention employee resource groups. I did mention walkouts, letter writing campaigns, external accountability. These things kind of, again, they're high energy, but low impact, and require sustained energy over time, sustained high energy over time. And so these are some ways of checking and making sure that things incrementally change. Hopefully, the idea is to change the mindset of the power brokers in your organization to be much more progressive and egalitarian, thinking about how people operate in the workplace and the things that, the coercion in the workplace, and being more flexible and all these things. And a collective show of force kind of does that to a certain degree, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. People revert back to old behaviors. It's not always sustainable. So I think I share, your pessimism and sometimes cynicism here, Janice, on how exactly we can maintain this stuff, but it requires a lot of sustained energy. I know a lot of ERGs that I've worked with, very excited in the outset, do a lot of great programming, mostly celebratory. I mean, that's fine in the moment, but momentum loses out, right? People get diversity fatigued. They question why they don't do this. They're not compensated adequately. So compensation for ERGs is important. The people putting the labor into the ERGs is important. And so that's an alternate, like, structural check to unions, but I would never say ERGs take the place of unions. I will say that sometimes, for example, I've seen a lot of success from the employee resource or affinity groups that focus on individuals' disabilities, kind of reframing, how we talk about disabilities, or even lobbying to get, certain accessibility items on the plate and that kind of thing. And again, it takes the reception of the power brokers in an institution to make that, to foster that change, to drive that change. But sort of that's this collective show of force that we're talking about. All of it is, again, it's fleeting, right? It can collapse at any moment. There's no, in the absence of a union, there's nothing structurally holding it in place. There's so yeah, there's certain things that we can do to express power. Most of it is in the moment, just like the Google walkout, just like the Starbucks thing. But without a true deconstruction of the power structure of an organization and a reimagining of it, it's a lot of energy, I would say.
Yeah, I think sometimes we just have to be honest with the structures in which we work, and just do, like, a lot of us are just doing what we have to do to survive the structures that we're in. And, it is unfortunate that a lot of these larger companies, especially those that have been around for a while, I never say anything is impossible, but it's almost impossible to change the power dynamics, because there is no incentive to hold leaders accountable. Why would I want to, if I'm a leader, why would I want to hold myself accountable? There's no incentive or push to do that. So I can I can hire people from different backgrounds and with different abilities. Does that mean I'm treating them fairly or treating them equitably? Who's holding me accountable for actually doing that? So I think that for a lot of folks, the sad reality is that change will not come until we leave those environments and those structures. And I think there is privilege in being able to leave a toxic environment. And many people cannot do that. So I think that the internal person, or even the external person that comes in to help the organization, should serve as like a barrier at the very least, so that the sort of like harmful behavior that you were experiencing, there's sort of like a shield. You may still experience it, but that person who is hired on behalf of the organization is working on behalf of the employees to help them. And that could be, some companies have an ombudsman, where it's like an external entity that is helping to resolve issues. And employees need to know that those resources are available. I was speaking with somebody who works in a university, and she was saying she didn't even know her university had an ombudsman. She didn't even know that there was this external person outside of HR, outside of leadership, that she could speak to. So there are resources that are available to employees. Employees just don't always know that those resources are available. And I know I saw Constance in the chat had said it starts with fostering trust with those employees. And I think that in a lot of organizations, the trust has been broken, and it's going to take a lot to rebuild that trust, but it starts with accountability, and leaders have to be accountable and holding themselves accountable. But I struggle, because I feel like there isn't an incentive for leaders to hold themselves accountable. So how do you make people like be introspective and think about the ways that they're creating the environments that they're creating? So that's what I struggle with. But I think that one thing that, when you think about collective power, one thing that we have to understand is that sometimes changing the environment is going to take, unfortunately, sacrifices. And you might have to be that person to speak up and to stick your neck out. And there are consequences that might come with that. But I try to think about it as far as I'm making the environment better for the people that come after me. So if I have to be the sacrificial lamb of my organization for change to actually happen, then for me, I'm kind of like, so be it. And it's unfortunate. I know that some people just want to go to work and clock in, clock out, and be done with it, and not be like the martyrs of their organization. And it's, but I think that that's important to also think about. And how do we get back to that community mindset? Because I do think in the workplace, a lot of us are sort of like, how can I move and advance and ascend within this company without thinking about the collective? So I think that it's important for us to get back to that, because that's where the true power lies, is in that collective.
Awesome. I have to hit the time for you too. I know I could just let you run but then we wouldn't hear from Ted, and Ted's got some really important insights into this conversation, and some of the alternative structures and models that we desperately need exist in the world. They're out there, and I'd love to hear a bit more about them. And so before we shift over to you, Ted, I'm wondering if everybody in the chat, this has been, there's some cynicism, there's maybe a little bit of skepticism, maybe a little tinge of pessimism around what's possible inside of the current power structures as they've grown up, their roots in colonial mindsets and capitalism at large, the hierarchy, those types of things. It is pushing uphill, I think, for a lot of the time. But I would love to hear in the chat something that you're drawing inspiration from, or something that gives you a spark of hope, because those are important. Those sparks feed the fire. And so let's take a minute or so, and everybody on the call, if you can think about where are you drawing some inspiration from, some hopefulness, a spark of something, and let's get it in the chat, and let's get a big thread of all the great things, and then we'll shift over to you, Ted. Okay, and I'm going to have to go through and read these after the fact. We'll save them; they get recorded, and so we'll consolidate them. But it's going to be too much of a fire hose here in a second as everyone puts their stuff in. So keep at it. Put some stuff in there that you're drawing inspiration or a spark from. And with that, Ted, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'd love to hear what you have to say on this topic and sociocracy. Kind of the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for having me here. So I hope to offer a little bit of a glimpse of a little how things could be differently or different. So the system that I'm going to talk about, sociocracy, I want to just make one little connection here, comes from the Netherlands, and it's been developed around the time I was born. So I'm just somebody talking about it. I had no contribution in making it, and I'm in awe because it's a really smart system. And one little fun fact on that, since we've been talking about unions, is the following thing. So as we all know, right, in Europe, unions are a little stronger than in this country. And by the way, I'm from Europe myself. And one aspect of that is that in the Netherlands, where sociocracy comes from, companies that, given their size, would be required legally to have a union, don't have to do that. They explicitly exempt if they're sociocratic. Because the logic of sociocratic organizations is that the workers don't need representations because they are the decision makers already. So we don't need that external adjustment or somewhat internal kind of the patch, right? Because we've already set it up in a way so that the workers are it. That is who's running it. So one, I guess, overarching kind of to give you a little glimpse in what we're trying to do with sociocracy is just a little metaphor. So we use the metaphor of water, which actually I stole from somewhere completely different and from The Soul of Money, I think. But so if you have a lot of water in one big blob, right, and you keep it just there, it's typically going to go bad, right? And that's what happens if you have a lot of centralization of power, right? And what we're trying to do in sociocracy is to have like an irrigation system, right? That kind of takes the water and puts it places and kind of moves it along into many places so a lot of things can grow. So we're trying to decentralize power and put it into the appropriate places. So and here's how we do that. There's two parts on that. One is the big question of who decides, like where does power go? Who decides about what? And the second one is how do we decide? And as we all know, in hierarchical systems, things tend to be decided by individuals. And here we're trying to shift to a more collaborative power by groups. And so I'm going to talk about both of those, the who decides and how do we decide. I'm going to start with how do we decide, just to give you a little bit of an overview of the tool set, just also to see just what's possible. So how we decide is decision-making by consent, which is very similar to those of you that are familiar with consensus. It's a little bit of a tweak on it, depending on how you practice it, but I'm not going to go into the super fine details here. The point of consent is if a group makes a decision and they're the decision maker on it, That proposal moves forward if there's no objection, no reason to say no. And the cool thing about that is kind of hits that sweet spot between endless talking, right? Trying to make everybody happy. Like everybody has to be fully on board and even have their extra, like whatever wishes, like the whole wish list in the proposal, versus we're just shutting people down and we're not interested in what they even think, right? And so we're in between, we're kind of moving forward if things are good enough. There's no problem, so that means we can go, and then we can learn together. So it all puts us into a learning position together as a team. And by the way, that's also how we decide, for example, who's the leader. I'm the executive director of the organization that I work for, Sociocracy for All, and I was elected into that role by consent. So the people who are the decision makers on that decision, each one needed to give their consent to have me in that role. So I was not just put into that place. I had to, people have to kind of earn the trust of the people that they work with to be in that position. Then there are a few other things that kind of just make life easier to hear people the first time. That's how I typically say it, so that objecting to a proposal doesn't become the first time you ever asked for your opinion. For example, there's little things like we tend to talk in rounds, just one by one by one in meetings, because that way, whatever proposal we come up with together, we've already co-created. So it's not even a question of checks and balances. I think of it more as creating an ecosystem that is already collective, that is already collaborative, so that we don't need that check at the end. That's just kind of the safety net at the end. Another thing, for example, is that we, when we plan a meeting, the agenda for that meeting requires consent from everybody present. And a reason to object, for example, would be, you again didn't put my topic on the agenda, or no, this takes way too long, or no, this is not actually relevant right now. So people's voice in how they spend their time is taken very seriously. And that's something I personally really like about it. So again, voice and inclusion are really the design principles to make all of that happen. So that's all about how we talk to each other and how we have meetings and how we decide. What's really fascinating is that second topic of who decides what. And the way we do that, think back to the irrigation system, okay? We need all that power, that agency to make things happen, right? As Jeff was saying, or something along those lines. We need it in many different places, wherever people do work. So what we do is we say, okay, who works in this area? Okay, you guys work in this area, you make the decision on that area. It sounds ridiculously simple, but that's how it's done. So in kind of sociocracy jargon, that means we have the domains, so those are the areas of decision making, and everybody who works in that domain tends to be a decision maker on that with a little bit of refinement. And then we have subsets of that. So for example, if you have a marketing circle group, a subset of that would be social media, right? A subset of that might be the TikTok team that is doing that. So the TikTok circle would make decisions about TikTok, and nobody can override their decisions. So social media as the next higher circle cannot override a decision that only has to do with TikTok. And that way we really have autonomy and local decision making, and that's one of the key pieces. So circles need to have full decision making power in their domain. Then those circles make decisions and they define roles that they want to have and give those roles to people, all by consent. So we're kind of building our own system of how power gets distributed and how we empower people to do certain things and what we want them to do. And we can change that at any given point in time because it's just our system that we're building for our social media circle. And in that way, as I said earlier about the unions, every worker is a decider somewhere, right, in that area where they work. And it also tends to be, it's not a requirement, but it tends to be that every person has more than one role. Like I have, I don't know, 15 roles or so. So it's not only that I walk around being the executive director all the time. That's actually a small sliver of my time. Most of the time I'm part of, actually social media circle and, this other thing and this other thing. So it happens actually, and that's quite sweet, I find. In some circles, let's say any given person might be in some circle the leader of a circle I'm a part of, while in this other circle, I'm the leader and that person is a part of it, right? So we have these different relationships depending on what hat we're wearing. So that typically makes it less likely that one person becomes like that big shot and has kind of an overbearing amount of power. One other example of just give you a little bit of a taste of what that looks like is we also have a design principle that if you have a circle, like a circle of 5 here and another circle of 5, let's say this is social media and this is TikTok, right? So this is a subset here. And now we have 2 people that are on both circles. And that way we make sure that the higher circle, so to speak, cannot just override the other one on anything. They can make a decision that would be to the disadvantage of that circle, because the 2 people that are also part of that circle, they would absolutely object and say no. Like, no, this is not going to work for TikTok. No way, we can't do it. So any decision has to be made kind of in mutual consent, because and in alignment, so that everything fits together. And that's how we kind of build from the bottom up a system that stays coherent, at least if people pay attention. So the strength of this is, or the strengths of this system of sociocracy are, it's absolutely doable. One can do it now, right? It's not something in the future, it's something for now. And in fact, there are a bunch of sociocratic organizations. It's not kind of a dream, it's already been done, right? So it's pretty tried and tested already. And it's fairly flexible. Like you can, it's kind of more like a design principle toolbox where you can kind of piece it together. Of course, there are kind of logical ways of doing it and some that are kind of workarounds. Some of the shortfalls I do want to mention, because it really applies here, is that it's this way of building an organization is really just, but that's already a lot, but it's still limited to that, a leveling of the playing field, right? Biases still exist. It's still harder for some people to object than for others, right? If you grew up knowing that your voice will be heard, it's going to be easier for you to object than for other people who have not had that experience. So it's a little bit like you take that shell away, right? But the imprint is of course still there, and it needs a whole other set of tools to undo that, or to at least weaken that effect. So I was, for example, listening to the Starbucks incident, right? And I do remember that some vaguely, but that kind of stuff might still happen, because that, like, you can't really, with a system like sociocracy at least, you can't really undo that would ever happen. You might change the response of that, but that incident might have still happened the same, because maybe even each Starbucks, whatever they're called, like each of the cafes might have more local autonomy, and then that's just what it is. So I'm just pointing that out because sociocracy, I think, is doing a lot, but it's not doing everything. It's not a magic fix at all. It's kind of a web of other things that need to click together. So it really just applies to that positional power, and somewhat to that collective power. So on those levels on the slides. One little comment, because I saw it in the chat. Somebody was wondering about how to start an organization. And there is one book, it's called Who Decides, Who Decides, that is exactly talking about how do you start with a small organization and decentralize and kind of share from the very beginning, so you don't even run into those founder things and all of that stuff. So that's that. I'm complete for now.
Yeah, that's what I was gathering from the chat, Ted, is some folks may be wondering, if you are in an organization that is not Socratic, how could you shift the environment to be, or the structure to be like that, especially if you don't have a lot of power within that organization. So
yeah, and that's, I need 2 minutes to explain that, because that's really the most maddening part of my job. It's absolutely frustrating, because here's the following thing. If you have a hierarchical situation, okay, like the boss of a company comes to me and says, I love sociocracy, I want to implement that. Then, of course, in the typical setup, now everybody who's working under that person will go like, oh, really? If it comes from you, I'm not sure I trust it. So then it's kind of this whole community organizing effort to get people to understand, now, this is actually probably a good idea, even though it comes from your boss, okay? But now if it's the other way, Then you have the people at the bottom, so to speak. And then that also happens. We see both of them almost equally, and both of them are maddening. So you might have the people with less power in the organization that fall in love with sociocracy, and all they want to do is that, okay? And then it doesn't go anywhere. And I've had, for example, people drop out of trainings that were like, this is too frustrating because I don't even want to hear it because I know I can't have it. So it almost, in order to implement it, either has to be small enough that it just works, you know, if you don't have this big power differential yet, or it requires a lot of kind of getting people on board, training people, see, like making sure they understand, but there's a lot of chicken eggness to it. And sometimes it doesn't happen, although everybody wants it. And that's the most infuriating part of it. You know, just because structurally we're basically caught in our positions, everybody mistrusts everybody. And although everybody would just have to make one step forward together, they're somehow not doing it because they're in a system. You kind of have to work with that old system to implement a new system, right? And that's where we constantly get caught up somehow. So that is really the most painful part of what I do, just to see how even with best intentions it can be so hard to make it there.
Lots to discuss here, lots more. I think yesterday we were already talking about a round two as we were chatting as a panel. It's like there's so much richness here. There's a round 2 and 3 and all of that. And so stay tuned, that might be coming. I do want to be mindful of everybody's time and recognize that we've got about 10 minutes left in the session, and did want to create some space and time for question and response. We do question and response here because we may not have answers, but we probably have a response or something to a further question. So if you have questions, there's been a few in the chat and I can kind of pull those out as we go, but now's a great time to think about a question that you might have, or a wish that you have for a further deeper conversation about something that may be sparked for you today around any of the topics from the speakers. And I did just drop a bunch of resources in the chat. And so if you want to go through and just grab a few of them, some things on sociocracy, how to connect with Janice, some writing that Farzin has done on sovereignty and solidarity, some great stuff there. And so I encourage you to check that out. And there'll be a follow-up email with the link as well as the recording and all of that kind of stuff. So don't worry if you miss something today. We'll make sure we get it to you. Yeah, Alexandra, are there any organizations that folks can shout out that they admire for the ways they intentionally try to dismantle power and oppression in their organizations? I'd love to use the chat for that if people do want to do that shout out, and I will put that question to the panel. Are there some examples out there that you're working with or that you're aware of that are doing this work of dismantling and rebuilding and distributing power?
I'll just quickly jump in with a couple resources. So there's a very interesting burgeoning cooperative movement that's popping up all over the United States. I think the Bay Area is the most progressive. There's an organization called Project Equity that's actually helping people like workers. I think they're mostly in the manufacturing. I don't think they've entered, though, correct me if I'm wrong, services yet, but they help people buy out their organizations, right? So, and it's not just ESOPs, it's actually employee-owned organizations, and they make collective decisions and they distribute power. So that automatically means that they distribute wealth as well. So cooperatives have been shown to people make a lot more money, people stay near 100% rates of retention. That's one resource. Democracy at Work is another. There are a lot of organizations like that are popping up that are talking about participatory decision-making and self-management in the workplace. That the Democracy at Work is a good starting point. There are endless amount of resources now that mostly coming out of Europe as well, and South America, and actually all over the world. So, but those are two places to start to take a look.
Excellent. There's a question here from Sinyi around accountability mechanisms that we can suggest, especially for junior employees, ways to hold leadership accountable. And I'll let the panel think on that, and I'll take a quick stab at answering it from some experiences that I've had trying to hold the bureaucracy accountable, one of those big amorphous kind of healthcare system. And some success that I had in that was forcing leadership's hand to really clarify values, to operationalize values, to say, hey, that thing up on the wall, that patient-centered statement, what does that actually look like? And how important is that? And I spent 2 years resisting some pretty what I thought were detrimental changes to a program that I was managing. Just doing that, just forcing the hand of like, hey, you say patient-centered, but then you're talking about making this decision. And those two, like, help me understand how that supports this. Oh, it doesn't. Oh, well, then I guess we should have a deeper conversation about it. And so that was me resisting change, and through accountability, through what was hopefully a shared set of values. And eventually it came to the place of like, yeah, we say that, but we don't actually mean that. We say patient-centered, but more important than patient-centered is saving some money or something. But it kind of forced the hand to make it transparent what the decision-making criteria was behind what was being asked. And so then at least we're talking about the truth. We're not thinking that we're talking about this value of, and I see this all the time where you walk into a boardroom and it says collaboration up on the wall, and then you sit in on the meeting or you watch the behavior. It's like, that's not collaborative. So what's more important than collaboration? Something else is more important. Let's actually talk about that thing, and let's force leaders to acknowledge that, to come to terms with that. And then we're at least having an open and honest discussion about what's truly important to the team. And so I've had some success with getting values named and the associated behaviors really clarified. So that's one thing. Panel, any other ideas on accountability for leaders, mechanisms that exist or that people can try?
Yeah, I would suggest two things. The first thing is having the organization or suggesting that they implement something like a 360-degree feedback system. The way that performance reviews usually occur within organizations is top down, where managers are giving feedback to their direct reports, but direct reports and junior employees don't have an opportunity to also give managers feedback. So I think introducing some sort of 360-degree feedback system that allows employees to anonymously rate or give feedback on their managers is really important, and is a good system that I think you could encourage the company to implement. And not being able to advance within an organization without receiving that feedback is really important. I don't see this happening a lot within organizations. But I also think when people are coming into the company, HR plays such a vital role in assessing people's commitment to equity. And there should be questions in the employment interview that assess a person's interest or commitment to equity. I don't see these questions a lot. Sometimes companies let people into the organization and they have no interest in promoting equity or fostering an inclusive workforce. So I think assessing those things from the beginning is really important.
And I'll add one couple more things. Like, so I think one, if you're new to the organization, definitely make the calculus to protect your own mental health and your own survival in the organization. That's primary for you, right? Especially if you're from a historically excluded community. Your own level of comfort is important. Second thing, I think a great way to think about it is bridging the proximity to power gap. So like if you're involved in a kind of mentoring program, make the mentoring program work both ways. So like the people being mentored have access to power, and they're the ones keeping the accountability, like keeping the changes top of mind. And two, another way of doing that is if you do establish an employee resource group, a good thing to do is establish a executive sponsor. So somebody who's the champion in the executive team or C-suite who is championing your specific employee resource or group of ERGs. So bridge that proximity to power gap as best as you can, with the caveat that your survival in the organization is the most important thing.
One tiny addition I have, because I'm typically in the context where people are already, we had set up a little differently, where you might have one group that is kind of working in the context of power. And my advice on that particular situation is to totally have your act together and to be realistic about what you can and cannot do, because the groups that typically come to me get completely caught up in, we want to change this, we want to change that, but we don't actually have the power to do so. They end up using all their energy on things that they can't affect. So it's like, no, first we're going to carve out what you have power over, and then we're going to make sure you have your act together on acting on that, right? But not kind of fight all the battles at once, I guess. But that I know it just affects a very particular subset of situations. I just wanted to add that.
Ivory had asked, with the goal of DEI being a long journey to achieve, how do you effectively strategize what issues to tackle so that you're constantly progressing on the journey? I thought that that was a really great question.
There's so much that can be, right? There's just so much. How do you prioritize? That's a great question. Janice, any thoughts, or Ted or Farzin?
Yeah, I think it depends on the organization. I think doing something like an equity audit is helpful, where you're looking at the structures and systems and the ways that the company does things. So what is the process to hire people? What is the process to promote people? How do you develop employees? And looking within those processes to see where there are holes in the process and where the process could get better. But the problem is junior employees don't have a lot of power to like change the structures. If you don't like the way that you are, if you don't like the performance management system or tool that's being used, I don't know if one employee can change that, but I think collectively coming together, you do have a lot of power. So I would say assessing the structures within the organization and the systems in which things are done to see where the most attention should be put. And I do think it's important to do things sort of like one by one, because I think where companies, I don't want to say fail, but where companies sort of have missteps is where they try to do too many things at one time. I'm a firm believer in focusing on one thing and doing it really well, and then kind of moving on to something else versus trying to tackle so many things at one time. So I think really figuring out where are we, is it that we're letting toxic people into the organization? So how do we make sure that we're stopping them at the door? How do we make sure that we're holding them accountable? And what is the best way to do that? So I would say determining what the most pressing systemic issue is, and then figuring out what sort of interventions you can create to address that. So it might be the culture is toxic. It could be leadership. And how do you hold them accountable is an important question. Do you have anonymous systems where people can give feedback? Because I don't see that a lot, where people have completely anonymous channels to share their experiences. So that was kind of long-winded, but hopefully it was helpful, Ivory.
Yeah, no, I think you're on point with that. And it's interesting. That's a lot of the initial workplace consulting work that we do here at the ALICO, is to create those anonymous pathways to get the true experience so that we can consolidate it and help organizations prioritize, figure out which problems to prioritize, and that are coming from the employees, not the leader, right? Because the leader's viewpoint into what the problems are always inevitably different than what the actual experience is of everybody else in the organization. And so I like that, maybe taking a step back and assessing, doing a little bit of assessing, because sometimes we charge off on what feels like the most important thing, and we're chasing oftentimes symptoms of problems that we could put our attention to something a bit deeper and more foundational. So that's a great advice. Yeah. There's more questions rolling in. So go for it, Farzin. Yeah.
I want to compound both of what you said. I see that exactly the same thing when we do our DEI surveys. The thing I want to add is that people are experts in their own relationship with the society, right? They know what they're experiencing. We don't have to gaslight them to say you're not doing this, right? What the expertise comes in is figuring out, collecting this data and saying, oh, you know what? This intervention goes deep, and it may have like address 2 or 3 concerns that one little change may have a, maximum amount of, output, kind of positive sort of outcomes from it. And that's where the expertise lies. I think when you really have to understand you really have to be a DEI expert, as well as understanding how to do these, to maximize the kind of the information that's drawn out from the surveys themselves. So you got to be knowledgeable on how to build the surveying, the focus groups, the interviews, and things like that. And so I think that sort of data-led approach to compound, Jeff and Janice, what you were saying is super, super important as at least a jump off. And to make it iterative over time, like things don't necessarily work. You get feedback and realize this isn't, working. We try again, experiment.
Right, we've got a few more questions rolling in here. Jordan, do you want to hop on the mic? And we're a small enough group now, so if you wanted to ask your question, about local government, dominant culture.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, this is kind of just where I'm hoping to go in the future, and I'm really trying to figure out how to, like, we have a majoritarian election system in the US, so it's always the dominant culture, majority culture in most cases, that um, rules everything. And even if one or two or a handful of people get elected to like a legislative body, for example, or like a local board, that's still not enough to get over that majority space. And I'm just really trying to think of ways and find solutions to that, like where we can like truly bring voices to the table. And like this is one of the situations where I see like building like your own table is particularly difficult in terms of government because it's already so well established.
I have two examples of something. Again, this is just from a sociocratic lens. I know two examples of where people kind of put one is a parallel system basically, and one is working within the system. So one thing I know is somebody in Brazil is was getting elected on a town or district level, and she ran with a collective mandate. So, and they internally were basically organizing themselves differently. So that's a whole thing about something. But I think what you're asking for is going more in the direction of the second example I have, and that is neighborhood parliaments. And they started in India, and it's super inspiring stuff. And what they've been doing is they basically started organizing people by neighborhoods, 30 here, 30 here, and then, sending people up and so on, like they have, I think it's 11 layers to get to a national level. Obviously, not everybody is part of it, but it's hundreds of thousands of people, it's still a lot, just given the population of India, it's still just a little droplet, but still. But what is really inspiring about that one is I heard stories of people saying, even like they have also a children's parliaments, that they were at a point where the children's parliaments and the neighborhood parliaments had so much trust from the population that people say, oh, if you want to get something from the actual, from the former government, go through the neighborhood parliament, then you will be heard, So they've really kind of started to become a little threatening to the former government. We're still not at a place of replacing it, right? But it's becoming really, really heavyweight in some areas, and I'll put some links in the chat.
Great, thanks, Ted. Mars, you've asked a question about 360, and I saw Janice, you've written out a little bit of a thread there about 360s as a mechanism for accountability, and that's also something we do a lot of at the Ally Co. is the employee experience, but also the 360s for leaders, because a lot of leaders don't actually know what their impact is what I find. There's a lot of unintentional misuses of power, right? And there's a feedback bubble that exists often. So how do we break that feedback bubble when it comes to 360s? Any thoughts on setting those up or advocating for them, especially if there's resistance, maybe from leadership? What's any advice or thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, Jeff, to add on top of that, hi everyone. It's that my org is pretty advanced in being liberatory, but there's some leaderships who are covertly stifling voting power, purposely like stopping like a mission and vision retreat, so we don't get to like the core issues, so we don't learn the history of the org. So I guess I'm wondering if I'm basically, you could say I'm the junior, I'm the youngest at the org, but yet I put myself in that position to be the sacrificial lamb so we can move forward, because I was recognizing all the behaviors. I am the one who catch the behaviors, even though I'm the lowest one there. So I guess I'm trying to understand, like I am protecting myself. I am taking rest. I am taking care of my mental health. I do go to therapy and talk about all this BS stuff that's happening. But to move forward and not to be stagnant along with this, and like kind of like, how do we take away the folks who are stifling the work and who is being problematic and who is like just having that hidden agenda of like money at the back end versus the programs that we're doing. So it's like, I guess I'm looking for advice on that from anybody who has any kind of ideas on how to help, because I feel like I'm doing everything that y'all are kind of saying, and the folks, some of the majority of the folks at the org are on the same playing field of wanting to move this way, but the covertness is very strong.
I wish you were at a lunch and learn we did a couple of weeks ago on intention and impact and closing that gap and figuring out. So I'll send you some stuff. I've probably got your email, and I'll follow up properly with some thoughts on that, because helping leadership, individual leaders, recognize the misalignment that they have between the organization or their employees or those people. Like, it sounds like there's a misalignment problem and you're not able to get back into alignment because you don't have the power to force that conversation, right? And so it's figuring out who might have the power to force that conversation if it's not you. And if there is a collective of people who have a desire, like, how are you organizing yourselves internally to force that conversation? And the beauty of getting an external person, a Farzin to come in, or a Janice or a Ted or a Jeff to come in, is that we're often given that mandate to align an organization. And so, off the top of my head, one question that I might ask, if there's resistance to a vision and mission retreat, you're advocating for it and you're getting it turned down and it's saying, no, not right now. It's like, well, help me understand how we're going to move forward as a company without having a shared vision. And those types of questions, how is this actually helpful? How is this moving us forward? How is this aligning us with our mission and our values? Forcing leaders to interrogate that. It's like, actually, you're right. We need a shared vision and mission. Okay, well, starting from there, it doesn't have to be a retreat. We don't have to spend 3 days offsite with a facilitator to do that work. We can do that work in a different way. And so it's prioritizing the work, because oftentimes leaders will stop the mechanism and they'll get in the way. They'll throw stuff in the gears of the actual, like, oh, we don't have the budget to go offsite. We don't have the budget to do X, Y, or Z. It's like, okay, there's 1,000 ways to build a vision, right? And to do that work. So that kind of holding leaders accountable and highlighting their misalignment or their lack of willingness to engage in alignment would be where I would start. And if you don't have that power, maybe it's a group of you that has that power. Maybe it's somebody else in the organization that you can leverage for that. I mean, it's tricky territory for sure. But off the top of my head, it sounds like how do we get people into alignment? Any other thoughts on that one? It's a big topic.
Yeah, it's challenging. And I see that that Mars put in the chat that it is a nonprofit, which I think makes it even more challenging in nonprofits, because that is a whole different sort of animal to when you think about it. But I would ask if it doesn't, I'm guessing the answer is no, but I would first ask if there's ways for you to give feedback in an anonymous way. It doesn't sound like there is. I'm making an assumption, but I would say some of the organizations I've worked with, I've seen how helpful that can be, those anonymous channels where employees are able to write things in and give feedback, and then someone in HR or someone within the org gets that feedback, and so they're able to address it. But it seems like there may not be that system in place. And if you do write something, there may be, given what you've shared about your positioning in the company, there may be a way to trace it back to you if you give that feedback. So I think it's that situation is really difficult, but I do think having someone external come in can oftentimes shake things up a little bit, because when we come into organizations, we don't know about the politics and the dynamics and all of those things. So sometimes we come in for a very specific purpose to like realign the folks. Like, I love the word that Jeff used as far as alignment. And so I think that might be great. Also sharing resources with leadership, but again, and finding those people that, I don't know if there are those people in your organization that are more open to change, or those change makers, because sometimes there are those people that do have power that you can align yourself with or chat with, who you can come together with to try to create change. But I'm not sure as far as like the structure, if you have those channels or outlets for communication. But I do think that maybe having someone outside come in to help with the realignment can be really helpful, because that person that comes from outside may say the exact same things, Mars, that you might have been saying, but it's coming from someone different. For whatever reason, leadership might be more receptive to it. I hope that was somewhat helpful, maybe not as much, but please keep us posted if Mars, if you could connect with us on LinkedIn, and please keep us posted, because I would love to get an update on it, because I know it's hard, especially at nonprofits.
Yep. No, for sure. Thank you. It was very helpful, and I will definitely stay connected.
Yes. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, for sure.
Excellent. Well, I've now used 20 minutes of everyone's time letting this thing run. And I actually, today's a huge day for us. We've got a big webinar coming up in about an hour. So at Cedar. So thank you for throwing that in. Power is relational, even though we often don't think of it that way, or we might see it as something else, but it's always relational. It always exists in relationship with an organization, a person, a system. It's part of that felt experience. So I would definitely recommend checking out Cedar's work, rightuseofpower.org. I don't know when the next training is. I know there was one recently, but it's coming up probably in the next few months. Cedar can maybe throw a link in there to that, because that's honestly, there's been a few things that have been helpful in my journey through the nonprofit sector into the kind of the world of consulting. And it's been the right use of power framework. It's been nonviolent communication, the work of Marshall Rosenberg. And those two probably actually stand out for me. And I'm interested in learning much more about sociocracy because I've been around the edges of that. And so Ted and I are going to have a good conversation about the connections here between the right use of power and sociocracy, because I think there's a lot to be discovered and to be looked at there as complementary systems of how we organize ourselves, how we make decisions, how we relate to each other and to the work. So again, thank you all for coming out, and I'm going to have to call it, and we'll maybe line up around 2 if there's enough interest. So thank you all for coming, and thanks panel.
Have a great Thursday. Bye, everyone.